Hello and welcome to History Hack for another special episode of Sharpshooters. We've got something really special this week. Rather than just Zack and I telling you about how the Peninsular War started and how we both seem to hate Napoleon Bonaparte, we're actually going to do some proper history. We're going into a cause, actually, that is both close to both of our hearts, which is Waterloo Uncovered. We are joined with a host of the fantastic project that not only are doing archaeological work on the battlefield, but are also rehabilitating veterans from current and recent conflicts. So we're going to look at both of those. It's going to be really interesting because they are rewriting history and helping people who've been scarred by recent wars. So there's some really interesting bits.
So we are joined by Tony Pollard, Professor of Conflict Archaeology at the University of Glasgow, obviously part of the Waterloo Uncovered team. Stuart Eve from LP Archaeology, again, part of the Waterloo Uncovered team. Katie Buckley, who is Head of Programmes at Waterloo Uncovered, and Sam Wilson, Archaeological Supervisor at Waterloo Uncovered. How are you all, folks?
Good. Very well, thank you. Yeah. Good.
Marcus, do you want to give people a little bit of a flavour of, I guess we should talk a little bit about Jugumar, first of all, shall we?
Yeah, we really should. This where Waterloo Uncovered kind of started, I believe, and it's where the battle starts for us as historians. Waterloo, for those who don't know, the two great armies with the two off in the sides are drawn up in the morning. The Anglo-Allied army, and often wrongly referred to as the British army, are drawn up on the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge under our hero, Duke of Wellington, but facing him, slightly outnumbering Napoleon Bonaparte with his army. And off in the distance, let's not forget, there are another two armies under Grouchy and under Blucher of the Prussians. So we've got a huge multinational force. And at some point, about 10:30 in the morning, fighting starts down at Hougoumont. Hougoumont is a chateau, a farm, Hougoumont Firm, and that's really where the troops under Jerome Bonaparte tried to break in to a few companies, often labelled as the light companies of the Guards, but actually there are German, there are Dutch, there are other troops there as well. Fighting rages on. Very famously, they shut the gates and trap off a few people. But now, under Waterloo Uncovered, they've actually started to find out there's a lot more going on around that area. And what I think is so interesting on this is not only do we have these archaeological experts in the room today, but when they're out digging, they have rehabilitated soldiers, some with mental scars and some with physical. And this is all part of the Waterloo Uncovered programme, which is what makes it so important. So really starting us off, I just want to know from each of you, how did you get involved about Waterloo Uncovered and how did it come about?
Well, I guess I might be the first on board. In the summer of 2014, I got an email from Mark Evans and Charlie Fournette, one of whom is still serving Coldstream Guards and one is ex-Coldstream Guards, ex-captain, and inviting me down to a meeting at the barracks in London to discuss a potentially exciting project. And I duly went, and in the very interesting environments of their barracks, we discussed what became Waterloo Uncovered, which Charlie suggested should be Waterloo Underground. And I still chuckle at that. I don't know why. I'm still not that jaundiced, but it became Waterloo Uncovered. But basically they said, how would you like to go to Waterloo Uncovered and direct an archaeological project, given that you're a name in the world of conflict archaeology. So I have to say, Waterloo Uncovered was never on my bucket list as an archaeologist, but given the combination of circumstances, which importantly included working with military veterans, which I was already starting to do then with regard to the Falklands War, and the profile of the project, which would attract some of the best in the business, I thought, I can't say no to this. So we agreed at that meeting that I would proceed with the team, and we built it from there. And then all of a sudden, the likes of Stuart Eve, who's a genius with the technicalities of field recording, came on board, and we've never looked back, really.
Yeah, so I guess I was next on board. I'm not sure about the genius aspect of it, but No, so actually I'm a professional archaeologist and work for a company called LP Archaeology. So we do commercial archaeology kind of in advance of property development and that type of thing. But I was also at university with Mark and Charlie, who, funnily enough, both have archaeology degrees. I'm not quite sure how they managed it, but they do. And I think what happened was they phoned up Tony, and Tony was like, that sounds great, but we need some archaeologists. And then they sort of looked through their little black book of who was still around and working in archaeology from the course. And I think I was probably the only choice. So they gave me a call, and we managed to get some diggers involved. So yeah, basically I and my company LP, we sort of look after the professional digging side of it as well.
They've gone off and got boring jobs, and you stuck with the art of digging in fields.
Exactly, because that's not boring at all, Marcus. No, not at all.
I'm glad you didn't describe it the glamour of digging in fields, because, you know, with the rain and so on, I guess would be creating a false perception of archaeology. Much though I love archaeology, I'm very conscious that I have two lecturers in the room, and don't want to suggest to people that they shouldn't study archaeology at university, because they absolutely should, and I'm just digging myself a deeper hole here. But having made a complete fool of myself, let's go to Katie. What got you into Waterloo Uncovered?
Well, classically, I did also study archaeology, so that helps. But at York, not UCL. I'm just going to get that in there. So yeah, I joined the project in 2019, actually, which feels a lot longer than that, I should say. But yeah, joined in 2019 after kind of graduating and messing around in journalism and other things for a few years. Realised I should probably go and do something I cared about, and ended up here. And weirdly, you know, some of my family are military and the other half are all medical, so they were finally relieved that I was no longer selling dresses online and doing something worthwhile with my life, apparently. So that's where I am now.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm sure people need dresses, but we need history. And we were talking about muddy holes, and somebody I always see taking photos in very interesting muddy holes is Sam Wilson. How did you get involved?
Well, it must have been around about the time that Tony had the kind of first meeting with Mark and Charlie. I saw his sort of name attached to this idea that there was going to be some archaeological work at Waterloo, and I'd always been kind of interested in the Napoleonic Wars, and, you know, I grew up with Sharpe and so on, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I know you're a fan, Marcus. And so I sort of out of the blue, really, I reached out to Tony, who we'd never met at that point. And I don't know if you remember this, Tony, or not, but I just emailed saying, oh, I sort of heard you're doing this project. And I'd done some battlefield stuff in the past with mostly Civil War sites and things like that. And I was starting a PhD at the time and things like that. So I just emailed him saying, hey, is there any chance, you know, like, there's a spot available, I'll just make the tea. I really don't care. Like, if there's any chance of me to get on this project. And Tony very graciously responded and said, oh, well, you know, it's kind of early days and we'll sort of see how it goes. You know, I don't really know what's going on yet. And so that was great. And time went by, and the sort of first field season was coming up, and I'd sort of not really heard anything. And I'd always kind of figured that, well, it's going to be a bit of a long shot anyway. Tony's a sort of professional, you know, and I obviously watched Tony on things like Two Men in a Trench, and I kind of figured that, well, he's got like a team, you know, of people that he always works with, and the chances of me going are like slim to none anyway. And then a few weeks before, I suddenly had another email from him saying, oh, by the way, are you still interested? Do you fancy coming out to supervise a team? And obviously, the answer was yes. And that was the first proper field season that we did in the summer of 2015. There'd been a little bit of work there earlier on in 2015 with a small group of people, which I wasn't involved in. But then, yeah, I came in that very first main field season and haven't looked back. It's honestly been one of the best things I've ever done.
Fantastic. Yeah, I didn't want to mention Two Men in a Trench because obviously all our listeners have heard Professor Tony on an Ungentlemanly Acts special. But yeah, I grew up watching him on Two Men in a Trench and seeing all of those bits. And
it's very depressing when I speak to people, obviously, of some degree of maturity, and then they tell me, oh, I grew up, or I was a kid watching Two Men in a Trench. And I have to say, it's really nice when people say I got into archaeology or history because I used to watch your shows on the TV. But nonetheless, it's a on the nose reminder that the clock is ticking.
You've inspired a generation, Tony. It's all right.
Well, that's really nice. But yeah, as Sam says, and not looked back, Waterloo Uncovered is a bit of a home now, I think. It's quite funny, actually. I mean, one of the jokes that goes around is that it's a retirement home for ex-TV presenters, because there's a few of us pottering about. And if that's a retirement home, then, I'm kind of enjoying it.
Well, we don't just have yourself and two men in a trench of TV fame in Waterloo Uncovered. There's Phil Harding as well. And if people haven't watched Time Team and like history, I don't know what they're doing with their spare time. That was sensational TV for its era.
Well, funnily enough, Phil has just today, I don't know whether, Stu, you got your email, but he sent me the draft of an article he's just written on his work at Jugumar, which will be appearing in a well-known archaeology magazine sometime soon.
Brilliant.
Once I've applied red ink to it, of course. But no, it looks great. So yeah, Phil is wonderful. When we used to do Two Men in a Trench, we would always find that kind of Time Team were in the next valley, and we thought, right, we'll go to a pub and we'll have a rumble between the two crews, and there was all this jocularity. And Phil and I, when we're on site, do spend a little bit of time taking the wee out of one another. But he's and as everybody else will attest, he's the most amazing technical digger. He's stunning, and he's just a master at what he does.
Yeah, that's 50 years of field experience for you right there.
Yeah, I'm getting towards that now, and I have nowhere near any level of skill.
It's the magical hats. He must still wear that hat, is all I can think of.
I think the hat took itself out to Belgium in the first year that we were there. It's so rancid.
Yeah, it is pretty awful. It's even got its own Twitter account, I believe. Phil Harding's hat. Yeah, his hat gets more followers than any of us put together. It's outrageous.
And the hat set it up itself. It is a sentient thing now. It's amazing.
You just need the problem with the hats building other hats, and we all need to. Right. Zack, can you take us back to Jugumar for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So Jugumar, it's one of three, it's one of four farm complexes actually that are occupied by Wellington's forces. Jugumar is out on Wellington's right flank and a little bit forward of the ridge. La Haison is in the centre, very close to Wellington's front line, about 300 yards or so. And then you have Papelotte out on Wellington's left flank. And then behind the ridge, you have Mont Saint-Jean. So Jugumar, it's really good that you've mentioned already that it's not just the Coldstream Guards that garrison Jugumar, because I think that is people's perception. I think sometimes people make Jugumar the be-all and end-all of the battle. It does play a really important role in that it draws in Rail's second corps. There's a big debate about to what extent does it get sucked into the fight for Jugumar. But the point is that rather than marching past it, Rail spends the day focusing on Jugumar. So it's important that it's there. It is claimed that Wellington said that Jugumar was the key to his line. Actually, if anything was the key to his line, I think it's probably La Haison, as kind of was proven over the course of the afternoon when La Haison fell and the Imperial Guard went in. But Jugumar has been the focus of a lot of myth making, I think. Everybody knows about the break-in, but as we're going to discuss, the Waterloo Uncovered team have found that what we thought we knew isn't quite what actually happened. So it's a really, really nice place to start our discussions about what you folks have discovered and why you started working there.
So yes, I mean, I think this is really interesting actually, and it's such a good example of where archaeology is doing something different from history, basically. So everyone knows these stories and everything, but until you actually start, we've done a vast amount of metal detecting, which is essentially our kind of our go-to technique to start recovering some of these archaeological artifacts. One of the interesting things about the metal detecting around Jugumar actually is in the first year, 2015, we started doing some metal detecting in the area of Jugumar called the Killing Ground. And we ran the metal detectors over, you know, took a sort of morning to do it, and we only recovered 3 musket balls, which was kind of insane considering the amount of fighting that happened there. So there was I think our conclusion from that was actually that there had been quite a lot of illegal metal detecting going on around that area, especially near the walls, because people can kind of come in and elicit the metal detect without being seen by anyone. And the battlefield itself is protected by Belgian law, so it is in fact illegal to do metal detecting anywhere on the battlefield. And so actually we were like, oh my goodness, we've just put together this big project and actually there's nothing here, it's all gone. So we were really, really worried about that. But then we, as archaeologists like to do, we got a big machine in and stripped off a bunch of the turf in front of Hougoumont and metal detected the stripped area. And then suddenly there's hundreds of musket balls. I think we must have about 1,000 musket balls just from the Hougoumont area alone. And those musket balls can really tell a really interesting story about what happened, which is outside of the kind of history books, and it's outside of the history books because it's super personal. So you know that each one of those musket balls was put in the barrel of a musket by a person. You know, like it's really a visceral thing, and that's the difference with archaeology, I think, from history, and that's something that we've really found there at Hougoumont. And well, Tony, I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about what the actual significance of those musket balls, especially in the killing ground, are.
Yeah, the killing ground.
Aren't they? You're changing our understanding of the battle.
Well, we are in our own modest way, and I think what we don't want to say is that archaeology has come in and basically trashed the history. I mean, we are historians as much as we are archaeologists. And so the accounts have really been a guide to much of the survey that we've done. But as a case in point, the killing ground, and the killing ground is a term that is not contemporary to the battle. It comes in later. But it's the area, it's the strip of open ground to the south of the garden wall at Hougoumont. And it's the patch of ground that the French, fighting their way through the wood, would then have to negotiate to engage with the physicality of the built structures at Hougoumont. So if they wanted to get over that wall, they had to get over 30 meters of open ground first. And while they're doing that, they're being shot to pieces by Allied troops on the other side of the wall, who are either shooting through loopholes cut through the wall or stood on fire steps and shooting over the top of the wall. And there are kind of vague descriptions of piles of French dead at the base of that wall after the battle. And there are 1 or 2 paintings which show that, which are pretty much contemporary. The interesting thing is that despite the wealth of documentary accounts and eyewitness testimony that we have from Hougoumont, thanks to the likes of Siborne and Clay and all of the rest of it, there is very little description from either side of that engagement next to the wall. And I've been through those French accounts that are available in translation, thanks to the work of 1 or 2 historians, and obviously through the Anglophile accounts. And this is the thing: the story of Hougoumont is very much an Anglophile account. It's been written by those on Wellington's side. But what the archaeology offered up was an incredibly visceral picture of what actually happened there. And I've done a lot of battlefield archaeology, and this to me, and I was looking at it, I was talking about this again yesterday, and looking at the plots of those hundreds of musket balls that Stu's just mentioned, and in meaningful groups. And what we've been able to do in plotting, and it's not just individual finds, it's their relationship to the next find and their relationship to the wall and to the wood and everything else. What we've got is patterning which allows us to see which parts of the wall the French stormed. So we know that there's a high concentration on the corner, the southeast corner. There's a huge cluster just a bit further down. And Stu and I actually had the privilege recently of writing a paper on this, taking this apart and looking in detail at what it means. And what that archaeology has done through the simple use, stalled as it was initially by this thought that, and there was nothing there, what the simple use of a metal detector under archaeological discipline has done has given us a really intimate picture of an engagement which cost a huge amount of life on the French side, and ultimately, and again largely unrecorded in the literature from the eyewitness accounts, resulted in at least a limited incursion across that wall, which then results in a firefight within the garden, which we've again got archaeological evidence for. So it's a really exciting, I like to think that in years to come, when if hopefully people are still teaching conflict archaeology and battlefield archaeology, this will be a textbook example of what metal detecting, which is one of the techniques we use, can tell us and add to the history. So I'm quite proud of that bit of work.
And it's been backed up by recent publications for people like Gav Glover, who've released books, who's looked at first-hand accounts and the archivist work, and they're going hand in hand. And it's not like in Sharpe, you know, for example, we just see this one break-in, bit of fist fighting, 30's probably dead, save the drummer boy, close the gates, Huguemon's defended. And I gave it as a case study recently to some soldiers in my regiment, and they start looking at these. Say it's a case study. People start looking at it, going, "Oh, well, there's a wall over there. Let's defend the wall." And that's not talked about with Jugumar. The orchard is forgotten. You just talk about the farmhouse. So I was wondering, maybe Sam, go and tell us what have you found in the orchard as well. That's not as talked about when we look at the farm at all.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things actually. In terms of the orchard specifically, I think what we've mostly found there is that we sort of concentrated in that area. I think it was mostly in 2015. And we really just saw a huge spread of musket balls, but basically indicating that the fight kind of flowed to and fro across that area for most of the day, which sort of backs up what the accounts say. We did at one point see if we could locate the ditch around the edge of the orchard, which was, I think one account suggests that the French may have used it, or it may have been used rather to bury some dead Frenchmen, possibly. But the real sort of interesting point that we have come across in the course of investigating the slightly wider Hugumar area was we've put a whole series of trenches and little what we call sondages, which are basically sort of regular holes in the ground. We've put those up against the actual garden wall that surrounds the ornamental garden at Jugumar. Because once you go there today, you see these lovely loopholes in the wall. They've got sort of stone round them, and people say, "Oh, well, that's, you know, a loophole that was made by whoever, and they were firing out of it," and, you know. But once you start to look at the wall, you can see it's just heavily patched. You know, it's made of all sorts of different phases of brickwork and things like that. And you start to think, well, what bit of this wall is actually original? So that was one of the things that we wanted to try and work out. Is this structure that we see today the wall that was defended during the battle? So putting all these sondages in at the base of the wall meant that we could examine the foundations of the wall at each of these points. And basically what we discovered is that the wall as it stands today is not the wall that was standing in 1815. It probably contains fabric that was standing in 1815, and maybe one or two tiny little bits that have survived through chance. But basically all of it has been rebuilt several times over. And if you look at historic photographs of the farm, even relatively recent photographs of the farm, you'll see bits that have collapsed, you know, bits that are hanging off, bits that have been rebuilt, filled in. And really there was some crucial evidence that kind of confirmed that to us. We had evidence in these sondages of where the wall had been rebuilt. So what we might call a recut for basically to sort of build up the foundation again. The very base of the foundation, we believe, is the original foundation built on the exact line of where it was in 1815. So that's the below ground bit. But in order to rebuild the wall, you sort of have to cut away a little bit so you can mortar everything in and build it up again. So anyway, that leaves a distinct archaeological signature. You can see where that cut has been made in what we call the section, i.e. the cross section of what we're looking at. Now, that recut is cutting through the subsoil, and the subsoil is where we're finding all the musket balls and bits and pieces after we strip off the turf, as Tony and Stu were talking about earlier. And crucially, within that subsoil, we found in some of these sondages battle-related objects, so musket balls. We had a bit of grape shot out of one of them, I recall. So what we know now stratigraphically and archaeologically is that that recut is cutting through material that was deposited during the battle. So therefore, it has to be later. So therefore, we can prove, archaeologically speaking, that everything that came above that is later than the battle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
That's a brilliant archaeological discourse, and I'd forgotten all of that. I'd forgotten your recut. That was that brilliant trench you had, wasn't it?
Yeah. We had a whole load of stuff in there, but it was a really nice little sequence and a really clear story. You could quite easily see. And you could see where the original foundation cut was as well, which was then truncated by this recut. So it was all very, very clear, and just a crucial little piece of evidence. And it shows you how, with relatively small amount of work, this one of these little sondages is only about 1 meter wide by about 2 meters long or something. You can actually get a lot of information that, again, doesn't change the story. The wall is still where the wall was, but we can now say that basically everything above ground is not contemporary with the battle.
Because I know people who've taken bricks from that wall. I think it fell down at one point, and they took them home, and they have a few musket balls. And I'm thinking, this is all evidence. It's really nice to have a Waterloo memento on your bookshelf at home, but it should really be in the hands of the professionals after a while.
Yeah, you have to specially select archaeologists, because archaeologists, by and large, though I'm got slight inclinations, do not have the collector gene. And I think it comes out of our training. We are entirely focused on the story that objects have to tell, which is our job, rather than the objects themselves. So you're in pretty safe hands with your cultural heritage if you've got an archaeological team on board. The same can't be said of all of those other types that come along. But people are educated. One of the things we've done is archaeology has had a long and rather touchy relationship with metal detectorists. And we first started using detectorists back in Two Men in a Trench days, decades ago. And at that time, archaeologists had very little in common with metal detectorists. They were basically the enemy. They were the ones that came in and looted the sites, etc. But we realized very early on that if you're looking at a battle from the historic period, and a lot of your artifactual material is going to be metal, you're going to need a metal detector to recover it. And so we brought these local clubs on board and started to work with them. And what we started to do was we learned from them, because I'm a firm believer you can't just thrust a metal detector into an archaeologist's hand. And these guys have been working with these pieces of equipment for decades. They know exactly what's going on, and the recovery rates are phenomenal. But so we were learning from them, but they were also learning from us. Things like context, things like the importance of spatial relationships, and how that a musket ball in a jam jar in your living room, or more likely your garage, means absolutely nothing, even if you know it came from Waterloo. It's just a piece of lead. But if you know that musket ball came from the middle of the killing ground and is from a Brown Bess and is surrounded by a bunch of French .69 musket balls, it has a story to tell. And that's continued into Waterloo Uncovered. So we have some amazing metal detectorists, both Belgian and British, working with us. And it's an activity that our veteran cohort really like to participate in. It can be really rewarding. And indeed, some of these guys were UXO experts in Afghanistan. They've used metal detectors, but for a much deadlier purpose. So
we'll come on to that in just a second.
That intersection of what we do. But yeah, it is phenomenal to see how that place has changed. So when you look at that wall, as Sam has said, don't believe everything you're seeing, because it ain't the wall that was there in 1815.
And you've also explored much further on the battlefield than just Jugumar, haven't you? Especially at Mont Saint-Jean and the reverse slopes. Tell folks about what you found there, Katie, because you were out there in 2019, weren't you, when I think this discovery was made?
Yeah, I got to ship everyone out there and make sure they were all playing nicely. So I'll leave it to Tony, Sam, and Stu from the archaeology point of view. But from a veteran point of view, obviously we unearthed some amputated limbs, and that was an experience for everyone working on it. That was in Camy's Trench, I believe, down the orchard in Mont Saint Jean, in what was kind of a bank that people had just shoved some stuff into. That was all my technical language, you can tell. But we discovered these remains, and we actually had, a couple of people out with us who had been in incidents, which meant, we had one particular chap who had 2 below the knee amputations, so was missing both of his legs as a result of essentially metal detecting and stepping on an IED, which is the very short version of that story. And he now actually is mates with one of our metal detectors, and he, out of the experience, there was this huge kind of dichotomy between their lived experience and an 1815 lived experience. And obviously Mont Saint Jean, Allied Field Hospital, to an extent we were expecting to find that, but what you can't control is how people are going to feel that and how they're going to experience it. And we work with an amazing wellbeing support team who I love to pieces. But actually what we were able to do was give people the space and time to be able to process that historical event with their own narrative. And it was really fascinating. And
how did they react? These are guys who, I believe, mostly Afghanistan, but maybe Iraq and some other recent conflicts as well. They've lost limbs, as you say. The Valen guys are going out. Effectively, it's a smart metal detector, and they're the most exposed to the IEDs, the roadside bombs. And they've lost limbs. I mean, where even 50 years ago, you wouldn't survive a double or triple amputation. The loss of blood would kill you. Medical advances mean that these guys are surviving and moving on and having to find new careers and luckily starting families and starting a new life, which is great. But how are they, when it's confronting them in front of them, a limb from a soldier from an army that they were in, probably, the British Army, loves its heritage and traditions, as we all do, and they see one of their forebears losing a limb, that must really strike home.
I think in that particular instance, yes, hugely. And I think the part that was so interesting was the space for reflection on it. This wasn't it wasn't everyone jumping in a trench pulling up a piece of bone, it was nothing like that. It was offset against the back of Mont Saint Jean having this Allied Field Hospital museum type thing that Anthony Martin's got there. And we had Mick Crumplin come out and do a bit of a talk, and we managed to find the amputated limbs or start unearthing them at a similar time to Mick being in that field hospital talking about it. So we were able to tell more of the history around it, allowing people to frame their own experience. So it wasn't, everyone had a very unique take on it. And from where I was sat, which was under a tree with this particular person at one point in time, he was very humbled by the whole thing, I think, to be perfectly honest, which is maybe not 100% the right word, but yeah, it was a whole different way of looking at where he was now and, huge medical advances and where he could have been then. So yeah, it was pretty special, actually. And we do quite a lot of other stuff on site as well. It's not just archaeology, shockingly. We do some creative writing and some art and, fun other things like that. And he did a really cool reflection with one of our creative writers, Nick Rendell, who's ex-Coldstream Guards as well, of course, So yeah, we were able to kind of just give him the space and time to process some of those feelings, which was pretty cool.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, Mont Saint Jean is one of my favourite parts of the battlefield, and that's only a little bit because it's the brewery and beer shop. But it is an amazing place. What were the other finds from the guys in the trenches? What else were you digging up as well as the limbs?
Mont Saint Jean. Well, you'll be interested to know that we got those 3 limbs, and to put them in context, as Katie says, we weren't just howking bones out of a hole. They were. It looks as though these are legs that were amputated about mid-thigh, probably in the barn at Mont Saint Jean. There's a description from a Scottish soldier of a pile of limbs in the middle of the courtyard the day after the battle. And what we think is that these have been removed from the courtyard and basically dumped in a roadside ditch at the back of the farm. And we think it's a ditch because we've not just got these three amputated legs. A few meters further up on the same alignment, we've got what looks like a large part of a horse. And so we're obviously very keen to get back and continue the work at Mont Saint-Jean, because potentially along that road ditch, we've got various deposits relating to the medical activities at Mont Saint-Jean. And among the artifacts, well, one of the leg bones, when it was analysed by our scientists, was discovered to have a French musket ball lodged in it, or at least the smashed fragment of a French musket ball, which gave some idea of why these limbs had to come off at the time. It was the only option. These soft lead balls shatter bone hellishly. But we also came up with a part of a scabbard very close to these three leg bones. And I took a look at this and I thought, that's come off a sword. And then I thought, no, that's different. So I took a look, and it is the upper part of the scabbard of a sword bayonet. And as you will know, only a few forms of troop had sword bayonets. And there's a good chance it's from a 95th rifleman, because the sandpit in which the 95th were based is the closest place on the line directly to the south of
straight along the road
of this position. So I mean, it's just an object deposited alongside these bones. So you can't say, oh, we've got the legs of a 95th rifleman, but there is an association there which seems to point to the 95th being wounded and tended in this makeshift hospital. So every object has a story to tell, and none of us are experts on everything. So we have to go back and look at the books and go, oh my, and in fact, it was a photograph of a reenactor which confirmed to me that this characteristic piece of equipment was from a 95th rifleman. But there was all sorts. We got a 6-pounder cannonball from the same orchard that this ditch runs through. And I think that 6-pounder, it's from a small piece. I think it's from the guard artillery that was brought up adjacent to the sandpit once Le Haisson was taken late in the day. And I think it's an overshoot from the bombardment at basically point blank range of the Inniskilling Square at the crossroads. And it's landed splodge in the field behind Mont Saint-Jean. And that's when it starts to kick off like that. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Archaeology is the closest we have to a time machine. I can guarantee that you can walk across that battlefield with any of the books that you want to name. You will not have the same experience of encountering, for the first time in 200 plus years, an object like that did its work probably at about 6:30 p.m. on the day of the battle. It really does make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
Yeah, when you described the limbs, thigh, my first thing I did is I stroked my thigh thinking of amputation, and then you said artillery fire on a hospital, and that is so evocative, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can just pause and go back to what we're talking about with the veterans for a second. Anyone wants to pick up, because this is really central to Waterloo Uncovered. What do they take away from the program, the experience? It's not just 2 weeks, is it? There's a whole project into this, and how do they get involved? How do they come about? Do you approach them, regiments, charities, or do they approach you?
I'll take this one. Well, so, it's a combination. We'll go with what do they get out of it first. So this year we're running 4 programs, which is pretty exciting. In the face of us not being actually able to go to Belgium this year because COVID, Brexit, boohoo. But, onwards and upwards. So what we aim to do is look at 5 key areas. So we help people with well-being, recovery, transition, education, and employment. And we can take on our programs any serving personnel or veterans. You don't have to be wounded, injured, or sick. That's not a prerequisite. So if you've got a real interest, come say hi. Our application process is currently happening as we speak for our 4 new programs. What we tend to do is go out to regimental associations and other charities and ask if they have anyone in mind who they think would benefit from our programs. And like you said, it's not just 2 weeks at Waterloo. There's loads of other stuff that goes on. So there's museum trips, there's wellbeing support, there's great follow-ups with us. You know, what more could you want? And people do tend to get a lot out of it. One of the main things I would say is that kind of sense of community, and everyone, it's a really great project, so everyone really stays friends, which is quite nice. Isn't that right, guys? Please say yes.
Definitely. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really cool, you know, melting pot of people who have a genuine interest. And you know, you don't have to be an archaeologist or an historian at all. It's just something that you might be interested in, and offering you the chance to do something different. We also work with the Dutch very closely. We're trying to make things as international as possible. So this year we were going to have the Dutch on site anyway as part of our veteran support programs, as we always do. And we were going to reach out to the Germans as well, but hopefully they'll be on a virtual program with us, which is going to be good. So yeah, that's basically it. If people want to get involved, they should email apply@waterloouncovered.com, and someone, probably me, will reply to them. So yeah.
I was talking a few months ago to one of the veterans that you've helped, actually, who I think now works on the program, Ben Mead, and he was saying that for him the beauty of this was that he could use his brain and body kind of simultaneously but also independently for one another, so it allowed him to kind of compartmentalize things, and when he wanted to, the physicality of digging could be the distraction. Do you think that's what particularly works about this project?
Yeah, I think so, for quite a lot of people. I mean, Stu, we've been planning a finds program recently. I think Stu put it in a much more eloquent way than that, but it was than I would put it. But it's essentially, you know, the monotony of a task gives you space and time to think about other stuff and process other stuff. And you're usually entrenched with someone who you can chat to about that should the need arise. So it's again that sense of community against the interest of the archaeology and the battle, which seems to work really well. But yeah, I can't remember the phrase, Stu, but it was a good one.
It was probably something along the lines of archaeology is 95% boring and 5% really interesting. I think that's probably it. So you spend a lot of your time just scraping away or whatever, you know, or indeed doing metal detecting, and you know, that's kind of meditative as well. And the troweling is meditative, and it takes a long time, and you're doing things really slowly. But what that allows, especially with the veterans, is if they're all working together in small teams in one trench, you're looking down at what you're doing, and you don't have to feel like you're kind of around a table and this is a therapy session or anything like that. They just have the space to, or we all in fact have the space to just talk about whatever comes into our heads, and there's no pressure or anything like that. And I think that is what works really, really well. And Ben obviously put it, you know, perfectly right there, that it's that you're using your body, but in order to, when you're using your body, you can also then just start thinking about other stuff and opening up in ways that you wouldn't necessarily do if you were face to face with someone kind of trying to have a conversation about your past, you know.
Yeah.
So that works very, very well. And
they must have a really different perspective on things. They're nearly always, you know, former soldiers, but I guess other services as well. And they're coming face to face with these things, and they'll probably be thinking at it from a different angle rather than academic and experience in archaeology. Do you find yourself kind of learning from them, putting a different hat on?
Yeah, I think we've all had this experience, particularly, and it first arose at Jugumar, which, and the fascination with Jugumar is that when you're on the ground, you know, it's not like looking at on a plan in a history book or in Google Earth. You're trapped in a space, and you know that next to that space there's another space. You haven't got a clue what's happening in it. Somebody's possibly digging a hole. During the battle, somebody was probably fighting for their life over that wall. But your viewpoint is very restricted by the built environment, which is less now than it was, because a lot of the hedges that were there are gone. You know, the walls are still there, if albeit rebuilt, but the hedges have gone. So it was a much more compartmentalized space at the time. And I've been in conversation with veterans, and they will almost step back and they will go, this is just like the compounds I used to fight in Afghanistan. These small enclosed spaces where, you know, that wall could have saved their life. They fired over a wall like that, or they've stormed a wall like that, or come through a gateway in a wall like that. And, you know, and quite amusingly, they would say that's a rubbish place for a loophole. Well, funnily enough, that loophole isn't in its original position. It's a remake. It's rebuilt into the reconstructed wall. So there are insights like that. And I've been with veterans. I've been with veterans in the Falkland Islands, walking across the battlefields there. And I just step back and I watch how they operate within a terrain. And I've had them talk me through it. I was in the Falkland Islands on Two Sisters with a Royal Marine veteran, and he talked me through his battle. And I said to him at the time, it was just us, and I said, I would give £1 million right now to have my students here. They would learn far more from you in the next 2 hours than they will in a lifetime of me in a classroom. And that's what it's like at times with the veterans. And it is very much a two-way street. Everybody's learning from everybody else if they've got the ears to be listening. And most of the people on this team have at all levels. And that's one of the wonders of Waterloo Uncovered.
I think that's what makes it so unique and so interesting to have those different angles, academic, rehabilitation and military, all kind of coming together on what is such an important battle. And we always think it's one of the most published battles and most talked about, and yet we're still coming to terms with the scale of it as well.
One of the things that has always been quite striking for me about Waterloo is kind of the scale of that death. And, you know, I know a couple of you here on this call will know that this is something that I'm quite kind of passionate about in terms of the graves of these soldiers on all sides killed during the battle. But what's quite odd is that we don't seem to have evidence of mass graves. They must have been there, but for various reasons, they haven't been discovered. So I wondered if you could talk us through your work that you've done at Jugumar, based around the search for that funeral pyre, that some of the images that we have handed down to us suggest was there, but your research suggests perhaps wasn't precisely what we thought it was.
I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but I'm just, as he sticks his hand up like a keen schoolboy, I've just written a rather substantial paper on this issue. Where are the mass graves of Waterloo? And Katie, have you read it yet, Katie?
Yeah, I actually have read it. It's very good.
Good, thank you.
Great answer.
Because obviously we've done all of this archaeological work. We've done geophysics, which allows us to see, you know, areas of disturbance underground. Theoretically, if there were grave pits there, they would show up. We've targeted a lot of these anomalies with trenches, as Sam was talking about. And as yet, we have to find a formal grave. Now, as you say, we were tasked by the curatorial authorities in Belgium to take a look at the area in front of the South Gate, which is now a car park. And we have a couple of artistic renditions of body disposal in that very area. One of which shows a shallow grave with naked corpses being piled into it. And funnily enough, also to the right of frame shows naked French soldiers lying dead at the wall that we were talking about. And the other is exactly the same location, slightly different perspective, a different hand. This one's by James Rouse, slightly more primitive, and it shows naked bodies being thrown onto a funeral pyre of brushwood. And what I've done is I've been through all of the visitor accounts from the civilians who were there within days and weeks of the battle, and indeed the artists as well. And they were there in time, unlike most of the troops, to witness the burial operation. The troops do it initially. It's very quickly taken over by hired help from local civilians, and they write about this burial process. And people like Charlotte Eaton, who's a fantastic account. She describes the charred remains of burnt bodies, but also the graves with skeletal remains in them. And so there's this very complicated mixture. It's a very pragmatic process of getting rid of the bodies. And I've been through these accounts, and it looks as though it takes around 10 days for much of the burial process, or body disposal, we should say, to be completed. And that is both burial in single graves, but also small group graves, maybe 3, 4, 5 men, but then also the mass graves, which may range from anything from dozens to hundreds. There are descriptions. I mean, for instance, there's a description of a mass grave in the Great Orchard at Jugumar containing 7,000 bodies. I can tell you for a start, there never was a grave with 7,000 bodies in it at Hougoumont. You're having to deal with hyperbole right the way through these accounts. But the point is that we have failed on every occasion either to find evidence for a funeral pyre, i.e. burning, or burial. And I've extended that research to look at these old stories about, in the decades following the battle, the commercial extraction of human bones for use as fertilizer, basically as phosphates. And the documentary, that record there is fairly convincing. And I'm now putting together that history, those eyewitness accounts and the archaeology. I think it's very likely that most of the large mass graves at Waterloo were mined for a human bone to be used on farmers' fields in I've got records for Scotland and England as bone dust. And it's quite striking that over most of the battlefields I work on, there are always stories of, oh, back in the 19th century, workers were digging a ditch over there and they found a mass grave, or they found this, they found that. There are very, very few of those stories at Waterloo. We've actually got one recently, which we're going to investigate. But I think the point is that within 20 years of that battle, all of those big graves that would be regarded as commercially viable and essentially be quarried and could be readily pointed out by locals. I was involved in the burial of that. Yes, I'll take that money. Thank you. Feel free to take them. They've gone. What would have been left would be those small graves, those single inhumations. And there are descriptions of these littering the fields like molehills in the months after the battle. But the point is that they are so shallow that the plough, which is reapplied instantly, within days or weeks of that battle, they are reploughing these fields. Those remains are just going to be ploughed up. They're going to be turned and exposed on a regular basis, and they are literally going to disappear. So it's no coincidence that the only single body that's been excavated by archaeologists was that was found when they were building the new museum by our colleague Dom. And it was missing its head because its head had been ploughed off. So you've got a double blow there. You've got the mining of the big graves for fertilizer, and you've got the ploughing out of the small graves. Net result being that for all those thousands of men that were killed in that battle, not many of them are still lying in holes in the ground at Waterloo. That's my idea anyway.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to read your paper, actually, because, as you know, we discussed about this quite a lot. We should say, though, that it's not just farms that you guys have explored and found some really interesting stuff at. You've also been doing some digging around the Anglo Dutch position, I believe, and have kind of found some stuff there. So how does the open battlefield kind of compare to Hougoumont? Stu, I don't know if you want to kind of take that one.
Well, it's complicated. And basically, we're in the same problem as we were with Hougoumont, in that unless you strip off the topsoil and start metal detecting the subsoil, the artifact density is very, very low. And that is actually, in most of those areas, that's to do with the plough, probably, as Tony was saying, so that being ploughed over and ploughed over and ploughed over, and basically all of the artifacts are scattered out all over the place. We've done some work near the place where the Enniskillen Square was, and we've done quite a big metal detector survey of that field to attempt to kind of basically find the remains of the square as it was decimated during the battle. And to be honest, we do have sort of clusters of artifacts, but it's very, very it's very dispersed and very slight. So what we could probably do with doing is getting a big machine and stripping off the topsoil. But of course, we've got to remember that this is a working landscape, and farmers they've been living there for 200 years, or they've been living there for thousands of years, and have been using the landscape over and over and over again, and are still using the landscape. So for us to just come in and go, hey, this particular day 200 years ago is the most important thing ever, please let us dig up all of your year's crops of potatoes, it's kind of a big ask for them. I mean, we have done small bits, and we've had to pay for the privilege, and it's the most expensive potatoes that anyone's ever bought, I think. But so yeah, in terms of the open battlefield, it's tough to find things. The other thing to think about, of course, is because of the ploughing as well. In the last 200 years, there's been quite a lot of erosion. So the tops of the ridges will have been sort of ploughed and ploughed and ploughed, and then the rain falls, and then it creates colluvium in the valleys. So then the valleys fill up. So there's lots of places which would be super interesting to look at, like the area of the Great Cavalry Charge, where they come down and then back up onto the slope and everything. But that valley actually now is only a very slight valley, and it was only a relatively slight valley then. But even so, it's been filled up with loads more material, and that's enough material to obfuscate the metal detectors, so that they can't get deep enough in that valley for us to be able to investigate those places. So we've got quite a few challenges in the open battlefield. But one thing I would just like to say is, and this relates a little bit to Tony's discussion of mass grades as well. We've just this year, well, a month ago, have started on a collaborative PhD project with co-funded by Waterloo Uncovered and the University of Bournemouth, which is basically a PhD student called Duncan, who is going to be looking at new geophysical techniques across the battlefield. So over the next 3 years, and he better finish it in 3 years because I'm his supervisor, and if he doesn't, he's in big trouble. In the next 3 years, hopefully we'll be doing some much wider scale geophysics with some pretty fancy equipment in collaboration with Ghent University, which will allow us to get a little bit deeper and basically remotely sense the areas of metalwork, like clusters and concentrations of metalwork, without having to use a metal detector. And you basically tie this stuff to the back of a quad bike, and you can cover vast swathes of the battlefield. So that'll help us with looking for concentrations of metalwork, but it'll also theoretically start revealing some possible areas of mass grades as well. So keep your eyes peeled on that one. We'll see what he comes up with.
It's always developing, especially with the technology. One of the really impressive things of Waterloo Uncovered are the artifacts you're finding. I think I've seen a few when you brought them for a temporary exhibition in London, but there's a lot more that you're getting. But there's been real difficulties in securing the permissions to dig, because you're going under Belgian law, so it's a different kettle of fish. And this means that often you're the first to explore the area, though, when you're going into them. What are the difficulties with this, and also what are the items that you'll find apart from the musket balls, what are the other items you're finding? I'm going to direct this to Sam, because we've emailed about your frustrations, politely put it, into finding these permissions.
Well, I mean, the thing to say really is that we couldn't do this project without our Belgian colleagues in close collaboration with them. They're from an organisation called SPW, or they were. I think they've changed their name now. But they're basically the local regional authority. So we work very, very closely with them, and effectively they're there to make sure at the sort of bottom line that we do everything properly. Not that we wouldn't, but they're there to sort of just make sure we're in their patch. We need to work to the appropriate standards. Of course, we do work to the appropriate standards, and they're very much our colleagues as opposed to people who are monitoring us or whatever. So that's really the important thing there. Of course, there is for a lot of us, a kind of language barrier with speaking to local landowners and things like that. So having local people on the ground is essential. And in that builds up to actually getting out onto site. If there are people that are local who can talk to landowners, who can sort out paperwork, et cetera, then it just smooths the whole process. So that really is essential. In terms of the kind of artifacts, I mean, the vast majority of stuff we're getting obviously are the musket balls and bits and pieces like that. We're picking up a lot of things like buttons and other kind of smaller bits of kit. So occasionally little bits of musket furniture, things like that might have been broken. Tony obviously mentioned the little sort of scabbard fitting earlier, but we've had a few bits off of muskets and stuff like that. Gun flints is quite a relatively common one that we find, both sort of brand new intact ones that have just been dropped. Presumably someone's just fumbled with it while they're trying to change it and they've dropped it. And also ones that are clearly broken and have been discarded. And we've found both British and, or I should say Allied and French. And you can tell by the colour of the flint, basically. Of course, you can't find flint with a metal detector, but luckily they used to wrap them quite commonly in lead so that they would sit nice and tightly in the jaws of the musket. So, of course, the metal detector picks up the lead. So those are really, really interesting finds for me. I find them really interesting. We found a couple right down by the wall in Jugumar, and you just get this sense that there's an Allied soldier desperately firing as fast as he can at the French who are coming through the wood, and then his flint breaks and he's just as fast as he possibly can trying to change it, chucks it down, gets another one on and starts firing again. You know, it's a real little visceral kind of indication of the desperation, really.
You don't get that with TV and film adaptations. The flint's breaking. I said, boo hiss, I'm a reenactor, and have that problem where it blunts just randomly because some flint's stronger than others, and then you've got to change it, and you will find it's only a little piece of metal and it's going into two rudimentary clamps, and if you drop it second one, it goes, and you might fire it and then it lasts one strike, it's gone, or you might have one that will last 100, 1,000, and so it's like a thing of random. So it's a real personal, it could just sit there perfectly or let you down and kill you.
Exactly, yeah, it must have been, and obviously having your flint fail, if you are stood behind the wall at Jugumar, you've got about 30 meters and then you've got the wood, and presumably you can see there is a hedge alongside the wood as well, which is quite thick, but presumably you can see a little bit of what's going on sort of 10, 20 meters or so into the wood. You can see when the French are coming and you're firing at them as they approach, but really it's the last bit of their advance, and you can imagine having a flint fail on you at that moment as they're swarming through gaps in the hedge, you know, desperately trying to cross that ground as fast as they can. It must have been a terrifying moment because the weapon is the thing that's going to save your life at the end of the day. So yeah, it's a really interesting sort of indicator of the stress of battle, and to sort of think about the personal kind of impact that might have had on people. One of the sort of interesting things we came across, particularly earlier on, was, of course, Waterloo is an incredibly popular reenactment event as well. You yourself know, Marcus, obviously. And particularly in 2015, it was enormous. And you have thousands and thousands of reenactors coming in from all over Europe and probably further afield as well. And they're camping in and around Jugumar, in other parts of the battlefield. A huge part of the battlefield is where they actually have the reenactment itself. So we were finding evidence of reenactment material. We were finding evidence of the reenactor fire pits that had been dug in the turf, and just buttons and bits and pieces that had been dropped off of uniforms and stuff like that.
Which is going to look obviously but 200 years too late.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like replicas are exceptionally good these days, and with a few decades in the ground, it would start to look very much like an original. Luckily, some of the buttons we found had bits of like cotton through them and things like that, so it was a fairly good giveaway. And typically, they were all very, very close to the surface, and that was again part of that rationale of stripping off a little bit of the turf with the machine, is that you just sort of removed all that kind of debris, if you like, in the very top of the topsoil. But that's quite interesting to it sort of goes down the road of looking at kind of commemoration and how do we interact with historic battles and all this kind of stuff. So although they're a kind of contaminant, if you like, the reenactment related material, it's an interesting aspect. Often you get reenactments which don't take place quite on the battlefield itself. They're sort of off nearby, but not quite on it. So it was an interesting challenge anyway to sort of figure out how to solve that problem.
Yeah, that's really unusual actually, to have a battlefield with a battle reenactment with people dressed exactly the same on top. And how can you tell if a flint's from 2015 or?
Yeah, I mean, luckily when you have lead objects, after they've been in the ground a while, you get sort of lead oxide forming, which turns everything white. So usually that's a reasonable giveaway that something's relatively old.
Yeah, this is why you're the expert.
And of course, luckily in reenactments, mostly people are not firing musket balls at each other, I assume. Unless they perhaps really don't like the people, you know. But but luckily, yeah, you might get a few people who sort of casts the musket balls for a camp type activity. But again, you should be able to tell those apart from the real thing by the general lack of the patination on the surface. Another sort of slightly related point to that, although you can tell the musket balls from 2015 apart from those of 1815, there is also another battle around Jugumar in 1794, and it would be impossible to basically tell the material from 1794 apart from 1815. So that's another interesting aspect. The battle is a lot smaller, you know, but potentially we have got this whole scatter of objects, which does include some pre-1815 material as well. But
yeah,
quite how sorry, Tony.
Sorry, Sam. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. But as you'll agree, the irony is that the first people to loophole the garden at Jugumar were the French in the earlier battle. From what we've done, it seems to have skirted. This is the Battle of Fleuris. It seems to have skirted Jugumar, but we're at the moment hoping to go into another collaboration to do scientific analysis of musket balls, which we'll be able to hopefully source them. And if we do have two battles that are separated by decades, we should be able to identify specific groupings, which is all very exciting. And that, I think that's another exciting thing about Waterloo Uncovered, is it's not a hurried project. It's not a project that's dependent upon traditional modes of funding. I mean, I know in my work, television has paid for a lot of what I've done, but this is entirely different. And as I said, it's got all of these guys. Everyone in this meeting has brought their own skill base and people with them. And it's just phenomenal to see that. And people come. We had a meeting just this week about this new scientific initiative with a university, with an institution in France. And it really is, as far as I'm concerned, and I've been in the game now for a long time, this is a unique project. And I mean, we should get it embroidered in Latin or something on a coat of arms. It's the best thing I've ever been involved with. It's really amazing. But yeah, Sam's quite right. I have to say, you reenactor guys are fairly clumsy. I mean, the number of ramrods and drumsticks and Lord knows what else we pick up out the grass is quite phenomenal. But yeah, it does add that extra dimension.
Yeah,
well,
I think
from what Marcus has said, they're drunk half the time anyway. Either that, or he's grossly embellishing the amount of drinking that happens. But with what you've said, what's been your favourite find or your favourite moment from the various digs that you've been involved with for Waterloo Uncovered across the years? Let's just kind of go around the room. Katie, do you want to start us off?
Bit of a tough one, really. I mean, I would have to say, I think I'm going to get it right. The Howitzer Shell in 2019. Oh, Tony's like, oh, Tony walking it through a wood by himself. That was a strong day. But that was really cool. Because, you don't
get that disposed of, because it might have had explosives in it still.
Well, I'll tell you what happened to it when you get to me. Let Katie tell her wonderful story about a favourite find, and then I'll fill you in on the reality of
the reality.
Katie's version, I think, yeah.
My version's definitely more fun. So we were all very excited, and it was a very exciting experience. But yeah, I mean, particularly exciting when Belgian bomb disposal showed up and didn't think they'd be dealing with something from the Napoleonic era, as that's not what they're usually used to. So that was pretty cool. That I would say that was my number one. But honestly, the amputated limbs and what that meant to people was probably the most poignant, I would say. But yeah, Tony can tell his story about the shell now, because I've probably got it wrong. So
no, you didn't. You did not. And it was my call, because this thing came out and it was really deep, and this thing had splotted into the. It was French. splodged into the field. And so they dug it out, and we thought at first it was just I think it's a 12-pounder or even bigger. I can't remember the spec now. And we just thought it was a cannonball. So we're cleaning away, and then all of a sudden we recognize there is a hole in it. And at that point, it changes from being solid shot to hollow shot. And hollow shot, as you know, has explosive charge in it in the form of powder. And we thought, oh, here we go. We're right in the middle of the farm. We've got veterans, we've got students, we've got archaeologists. If this
gin factory,
we've got a gin factory. If this baby goes up, it goes up big style. Now, it might seem an overreaction because the hole was exposed. The likelihood is that the powder in it, if there was any in it, would be inactive. But I've heard enough stories of guys metal detecting American Civil War battles from the 1860s and blowing themselves up in their garages trying to clean these things up. So I wasn't taking any chances, and we can't. Health and safety on projects like this is a big, there's 100 people on site.
Yeah.
And this is me making an excuse for dropping the dime on the bomb disposal guys. So they arrive in their van in the uniform, and I'm used to these guys. I've done a lot of First World War archaeology, so this is instinct for me. So they arrive, and me and Stu are desperately trying to get photographs of this thing before it's taken away. And he's trying to do a laser scan of it, and Lord knows what else. And there's hazard tape everywhere.
Laser bomb. Yeah, it's fine. It's normal.
And the guys arrive and they say, look, this is really rare. This is really interesting. This is part of the Battle of Waterloo. And they say, well, can you kind of just hose it out and make it safe? And they went, oh, yeah, okay. So they go away, and then we phone them up 2 days later. About that howitzer shell. Oh, yeah, we blew it up. So, there was a really precious artifact. But the point was we couldn't take any chances with it.
One of them's got it on their mantelpiece now, I reckon.
100.
Yeah, possibly. But so yeah, that was a pretty good find. I'll quickly give you my favourite.
Yeah, what's yours, David?
I think all of us will say the amputated bones. There's no way that you can get over the emotional connection that we all had with that and the living people we were with. That was really special. Going back to what Stu was saying, the discovery, it was not a find in itself, but the discovery that there were artifacts actually in the killing ground after we'd come to terms with the fact that the entire site had been looted, which was a bit of a downer, which was why we did a recce. That was great. But coming out of that, and I use it in a slide for my students constantly, and it's the same sort of thing Sam's talking about, this visceral insight. It's a brown bess musket ball, and it's got a really deep impression, multiple penetrating impression in the top, this big hollow. It's not from impact. It's from a soldier driving his ramrod repeatedly into that ball to drive it down the barrel of a brown bess. That's not what you're meant to be doing. It's meant to be one swift, as you will know, Marcus, one swift movement, pressing down that ball into the breech of the weapon. This guy's got French guys coming at him, shooting at him, and he's going like this.
Do you know what he's probably done? He's probably loaded already.
It could well have multiple loaded, but that is the archaeology of stress and fear in one full lead ball. And I think if I had to pick anything, it would be that object.
That comes back to what Sam's talking about, the panic. Muskets aren't very intuitive. It's not like a rifle. You cock it, you fire it, and it points it the direction. It's so many parts of it can go wrong, from the powder to the flint to the ball to the spring. And yeah, if one of those goes wrong, I put 2 cartridges down, because you think it's fine, especially if you're firing a volley.
Yeah,
it kind of feels like you fired, because everyone else, these are loud, ugly things, and you pull the trigger and then kind of go bugger and then start loading again, basically. Yeah, I can feel that, like the panic between
amazing
that and the flint. So then, Sam, what's yours?
Well, mine has to be I suppose a collection of finds, really. But there was one which started it all, and that was initially a Coldstream Guard button, later buttons, and later also Scots Guards buttons that came out of Phil Harding's trench right down by the North Gate in Jugumar Farm. He was investigating a large barn that had been previously built up against the northern wall. And the thing, I think, Zack, you mentioned it earlier, there's this iconic closing of the North Gate incident that is, famous in the Coldstream Guards, and it's one of the sort of famous incidents of the battle. And of course, there are lots and lots of documentary accounts from the battle that talk about it and mention it and so on. But we actually were able to uncover the physical evidence that places those regiments in that particular iconic location during the battle. And for me, that was just a really interesting marrying up of the history and the archaeology. We know that they were there, but to have the physical evidence from the uniforms that guys were wearing during the battle was amazing. And particularly that first one, we couldn't quite believe what it was, to be perfectly honest, because it came out of all the demolition rubble, that was just everywhere in the trench. So that was really amazing. And then last year we found, 2019 when we were last there, we found quite a few more. And there was particularly a guy called Ollie, who was a serving guardsman in the Coldstream Guards, and he was really into metal detecting, and he found a load of them. And just to see the reaction that he had to finding those buttons from his regiment, it was amazing. It was amazing to see.
Brilliant. And then
that's it. Yeah, those are my finds.
No, they're a great find. And then Stu, when you're not lasering a bomb, what's your favourite find on the battlefield?
Well, now that the others have all used up all of my favourite finds, I think of something else. No, I'm going to say a very boring archaeological answer, I'm afraid. And it happened in, I think, 2015 or 2016, and we were investigating some geophysical anomalies. So it does kind of involve lasers, I guess, laser type stuff. Because we were looking for areas of burning, essentially, looking for possible graves or what have you. And we found two really interesting bits just outside the north gate of Jugumar, and we were very excited about this. Okay, this is it. First year digging, we're gonna open up one of these things. And instead of finding, a cremation pit or something, we actually found the brick kilns that were used to fire the bricks to actually build Jugumar itself. So completely nothing to do with the battle whatsoever, and 150, 200 years before. And I think from an archaeological point of view, that really brings home what we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to find this one day in the thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history on that battlefield. And it's really important to remember that Waterloo battlefield is famous because of the battle, but it has been in use for thousands of years. And everything that we're doing, we can always come across, prehistory or medieval history or anything like that. And sometimes I think we do get a little bit fixated on the battle itself. And it's important to remember that it isn't all just about that one day.
Great answers. Thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear what you find, because it's going to be different to what we look for when we go out there to visit. So thanks very much for sharing.
So what's the plan for the future then? Because Katie mentioned that, COVID, Brexit, you can't go out this year. Obviously, you couldn't go out last year. I'm sure there is a long-term project plan, but what are the next stages for you all?
Okay, Katie, tell them about the lockdown program.
Yeah, I know. Well, this year, thanks for the great nudge there, Tony. That was good. Like I said, we're doing some pretty cool virtual stuff. So we're running a virtual archaeology program similar to what we did last year, which is 6 weeks of amazing content from people such as myself and Tony and Stu, and probably Sam as well, actually. So you've got half the agenda on here already. And that's going to be topped and tailed with some wellbeing support and looking at the archaeology we've done so far and what we want to do in the future. We're also running a finds program, which is really exciting. So this is going to take place in the second half of the year, really, with applications open now. We're working with the National Army Museum too. So what we're going to do is take a group of veterans and give them the agency to create their own finds collections out of what we've got. And that will be going on display, pop-up display in the National Army Museum in January 2022. And we also have a creative arts program, which is along similar lines. So we've got a lot of stuff going on, but fingers and toes crossed for excavation July 2022, because we all really want to go back. So that is plan A. It won't take you through plans like A to Z, because they're not fun. But plan A, it's going to happen. Fingers crossed.
And I just want to encourage anyone listening, if they have missed the Waterloo Uncovered lectures, which I believe are on YouTube and your websites, I strongly encourage people, everyone from, well, I think all four of you who are on today, to a few from Phil Harding and other experts you've got on. Some are short and snappy and give you a little taste of it, and some are really in depth and you can really get your teeth into the history. I really enjoyed them during when I was on furlough and finding things to do, and I think now they're online as a resource, aren't they? So they're really good to they're sharing what you found.
Sam should be recording one right now. In fact, what are you doing here, Sam? You should be recording.
I've already done it.
You've done it?
Yeah.
You swat.
I know, teacher's pet. Yeah, I'll just give it a quick plug. Why not? So yeah, I just recorded a sort of another, like, I suppose, lockdown lecture for the third lockdown on the work that we started in 2019 at Frishamont Farm. And now that is way out on the east, the far east of the battlefield. The farm itself didn't come under particularly heavy sort of attack, but there were Dutch troops stationed there at the beginning of the battle. Possibly some of the very first shots of the battle itself were fired around there when the French cavalry scouts sort of probed around the area around about 10 o'clock in the morning, so pretty early on. And the interesting thing about Frishamont, also that's where the Prussians come across as well, of course, and one of the first places really that the Allies link up with the Prussians in that little corner of the battlefield. But one of the interesting things about Frishamont is that unlike Jugumar and Mont Saint-Jean and all the other farms on the battlefield, none of it exists above ground anymore, apart from a small well house. It was basically partly demolished in the mid-19th century and then eventually completely demolished in the 1960s. And so effectively today, it's just in the woods, really. And we opened up a whole series of trenches there to start exploring some of these structures. What we learned from Jugumar was that we can't always trust the depictions, even quite detailed plans might potentially be wrong. So we wanted to start exploring some of these structures, and there are massive structural remains under the ground still. And we really have only just scratched the surface. The trench that I was in charge of in 2019, we've got an enormous, great vaulted, either a latrine pit or a basement or a cellar that we didn't even reach the bottom of. You know, it's absolutely mind-blowing, the preservation. So luckily, because it was only knocked down in the 1960s. So we've really just scratched the surface there. And definitely a lot more for us to do for many years, I think, at Frishamont. But if you want to find out more, check out my lockdown lecture coming soon.
Brilliant. So where can people find the lockdown lectures? Where can people find more information? And how can they get in contact if they want to donate money to Waterloo Uncovered, because it's a charity? And finally, the veterans, I think Katie's already said it, but reiterate, how can they get in touch? So if you could all tell us a little bit about how they can get in touch, or Katie steer it, or whoever, we want to know more.
Well, the best place to go is the waterloouncovered.com website. There you'll be able to find all of our lockdown lectures. You'll also be able to find ways to donate, which we 100% encourage you to do, because, you know, we need to keep doing all this cool stuff. So if you've got some cash, do please share. If you're a veteran looking to come on a programme, if you could email apply@waterloouncovered.com and someone will be in touch with more information and an application form. There you go. Snappy, right?
Yeah. And the links to all of those videos are there on the Waterloo Uncovered YouTube channel. But if you're interested in taking it, you're reading a little further, we've also got online versions of our reports on there as well. I mean, the idea has been all the way along, and this was very attractive for me, was to have the information out there in the public domain as soon as we could, which I think we've at least partially fulfilled that aspiration. So yeah, that's all on there as well. It's your one-stop shop, really, that website. It's pretty good.
What I would also say is, if you want to kind of follow on future archaeological field work, basically as it happens, every time we're out there, we have a sort of running blog type thing on the website. So a dig diary, it's called. So follow on with that. There's loads of really interesting content, basically as it happens, and all of us, and indeed many others, sort of will regularly post things on social media and stuff like that, basically as it's happening almost. Tony and Stu have done lots of live kind of links up through Facebook and things like that. Yeah, on site. So yeah, sort of maybe follow on the Waterloo social media as well as some of us. If you,
we're going back to Belgium, not just yet, and we will be there for some. I'm really excited with Stu and about this new geophysics program. It will be the biggest program of geophysics ever deployed on a battlefield, and it's going to be really quite a thing. So we just can't wait to get back. But like everybody else in this situation, we've got to be patient.
It'll happen.
Did you guys want to go around the room and publicize your own social media accounts?
Mine is on Twitter and Instagram, Conflict Archeo.
I'm at Stuart Eve, I think, all one word on Twitter. I don't know what the Facebook is, so I'm not on the Facebook.
And I just run our work accounts, so.
I love the way that Stu still calls it the Facebook. It's so cute.
Oh, bless
I think it's just worth plugging it one last time. Waterloo Uncovered, which is such a fantastic charity doing rehabilitation and, rewriting history along with the historians and the academics out there. It's really changing our understanding of the battlefield whilst doing something so worthwhile. And when I talk about it to members of my regiment, they're really surprised that that's a thing. And I think hopefully that will slowly, the knowledge will keep growing and people will come to support it from the serving armed forces as well. So on behalf of them, thank you as well. And thank you for your time. It's great to talk to you all. I think I spoke to some of you back in 2019, I think was the last time we could all stand in a room and have a few beers, and look forward to the next time immensely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.